of today. So we will do a group brainstorming. So we will talk about this motion. It will take a few minutes, and then we will discuss what the ideas are. Obviously, the idea is to draw from what we were talking about today, but try to use it in as innovative ways as possible, and especially focus on illustrations. Think about those things as well, so that we can do the things we were talking about. Why this is actually useful to be doing. So the motion reads: this house believes that we should recognize the right to be free from intentionally offensive speech. Right? So we can ignore just this part, so this is just debate terminology. So what it basically says is that we believe that we should recognize a right to be free from intentionally offensive speech. Right? So let's just do together a breakdown of this title. So what are the key words in this title?
3 words.
Okay, yeah. Right to be free. Cool. Anything else? Yeah. Okay, so what I want to emphasize here is that those two things, I think, are two different concepts we need to define quite carefully. So think about that as well. Because, we just talked 45 minutes about different problems with those things and how we can differently define those things. So let's take 3 minutes. We get some ideas going, and then we will start talking and I'll write them on the board. Okay? Cool. Okay, I think 3 minutes have passed. So let's start with thinking. So let's just do 2 sides of the table. We will do proposition and opposition. So what's on the side? So obviously we're on one side we're arguing in favor of this, on the other side we're arguing against. So for how would they approach this problem? Okay, let's start with the basics, with definition. So how would we set up the debate? What are we talking about? What did you think when we talked about a right to be free from intentional offensive speech? What are the things that are involved here? What are the things we must be careful about?
We have to recognize what intentionally offensive speech is, meaning we consider the deliberacy of it, perhaps.
Sorry, what did you say?
We have to define what intentionally offensive speech is. For example, considering deliberacy, meaning intention.
Yeah, so what's important here, right? It's intent. So that's one thing. Okay, what else do we need to be careful here?
Maybe because recognizing the right to be free means also recognizing what would be penalties if someone broke or crossed a right.
Okay, do we have to start with that? So I think that this is one of the things that I want to talk. So when it's a right, what types of penalties does that imply? Exactly. So I think that here we are talking about legal penalties. So this is not a debate about social penalties, right? So we are talking about legal penalties. Okay, so yeah, we could do that. Back to this. What are other things in addition to intent? What are other murky things about this motion?
What the consequences of offensive speech are.
Okay, so what's offensive speech? Yeah, consequences. And do we have any ideas?
Ideas for arguments or for consequences?
No, for consequences. So why would we say that? What are the consequences of intentional offensive speech?
For all it would be probably. If you were to argue with Mill, it's there's direct harm to the person that's offended.
Okay, yes, but okay, so this is very philosophical, true to the core. But let's talk now about concretization. So if you have to explain to someone who's not doing philosophy, what do direct harms mean? What are we talking about? What has happened to us when we are exposed to intentional offensive speech? And we basically haven't told what offensive speech is yet. So either of those two. What are those things? So what did we talk about earlier? Offensive speech.
Offensive speech are things such insults that are basically aimed to hurt someone.
Yep. Okay, cool. So we have an idea about offensive speeches. So what are the direct consequences of that?
We will maybe hurt the other person, the person that they are directed to on an emotional level.
Okay, hurt them emotionally. That's one reason, right? So, if you're bullied, you're probably not too happy with being bullied, right? You're emotionally hurt. What else?
Gossip, especially I would say, like it's a social word, so like spreading lies that mean that more people can believe things that are actually false about you, and that could hurt your reputation and your the opportunities available.
Okay, that's good. But is that exclusive only to gossip? Which one is also problematic in this regard?
Also, stereotypes can be problematic.
Yeah, so stereotypes are the same thing, right? Because essentially, right, when we use stereotypes with people, it means that we subject them to different standards than we would subject them otherwise, right? So saying that someone, because of their background, is lazy or more hardworking, right? It doesn't really matter whether the stereotype is positive or negative. We are giving assumptions about people. So we can hurt them because they cannot live up to the expectations. For example, being an Asian kid, living out in circumstances when everyone expects you to be good at math and you're really bad, right? So this is a positive stereotype because it says someone is good at something, but it can be negative in individual circumstances because this might hurt you individually and you try to not be that type of person. Okay, cool. Is there anything else? Are there any other consequences?
Pragmatically, I think at the instance when someone is intentionally being offended, it prevents from constructive conversations to happen because they have an emotional response to that.
Good use of brain. I like that. Cool. Yeah. So I think that this is another layer, right? So what we did now, we have a basic setup, right? So we know we are talking about legal penalties. We know we are talking about, intentionally offensive speech. We know that we are focused on intent. We are focused on consequences. We know what it actually is, and we have some idea about consequences, right? So how would we try to summarize this in just a few sentences if you would have to explain this now in a speech? Anyone wants to give a shot? It doesn't have to be a private speech, just like a few sentences of how we can sum this up. Okay, so we can say, dear judge, what we are talking about today is about intentionally offensive speech. This is a speech that has two qualities. One, it's intentional, meaning that someone wanted to use it to cause hurt to other people, and two, it produces negative consequences, such as emotional hurt, social damages, and it devaluates our constructive capabilities. Right? And this is how we can sum this up. And if we get a bit clearer picture of what we wrote up here. So then we also can add a layer saying, so for example, what we are talking about, those are stereotypes, those are gossips, those are insults. And we as side of proposition believe that we should recognize a right for people to be free from this speech, right? Why? Precisely because of all the harms that it causes. So this is how we can try and approach it. So when we have this definition, because we don't have that much space, we have to erase some things. Okay, so how would we approach argumentation then? So we have we talked about three harms. So it's emotional, then we have, we said societal, expectations, opportunities, and the third thing we said was conversation. Right. Okay. Okay, so how can we think about those three things? How can we make now arguments about why this would be so? So if that were your philosophy essay that you had to write, and the title would be, we should recognize a right to be free from intentionally offensive speech. How can we approach this now? What are the things we want to talk about? What are the things we want to emphasize?
who the stakeholders are.
Okay, yes. For non-debate kids, what are stakeholders?
Stakeholders are the actors that are affected when you're talking about certain matter.
Okay, so actors and stakeholders. So for example, let's give an example of in this debate, who is one of an actor or a stakeholder?
Like, actor is the person that was offended.
Okay, yes, but let's be more precise. What we talked about a similar thing earlier, and actually like Brink talks about it, when we talk about hate speech. So one of the stakeholders, for example,
Like a black person.
minorities, right? So this can be one stakeholder. Then generally all offended, as Nika mentioned. Okay. Right. So we can think through it in this way. Yeah. So we can think about how those things that we talked about earlier, in terms of like philosophy, impacts different groups of people, and we can then explain why those are important. But what if we try to stay a bit more, not that fragmented? What if we talk about general? What are the things we can talk about in this debate? Other things, any other things? No wrong answers. So again, if you are writing an essay, a philosophy essay, you probably wouldn't go by stakeholders, right? Okay, how would you approach it?
Like the different, because probably the two sides will have some different definitions of what it means to be like intentionally offensive speeches, and maybe like a justification of why one definition is more valid.
Okay.
Maybe like can you explain an argument from one side and then like paint a picture for it.
So
Give an example basically.
yeah. So yeah, that's cool. But so yes, so this is what we will do in an essay. But we have two sides here, and we are only writing for 4. So how would we choose? So just let's brainstorm the arguments we would make for your 4 side. What is one of the reasons why it's bad philosophically? I mean,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah,
From
because
discussion.
then you exclude some people.
Yeah, right. So the first thing we can talk about is, quality of deliberation, if we want to be fancy. What can we talk about under here? Because I think there are 2 layers. One thing is what was mentioned here about it silences certain views, right? And what can we use from what we talked today? We can use things we were talking about earlier, right? So how hate speech applies here. Because, essentially what we talked about for hate speech, in many cases is also true for, like, offensive speech. Right? So in many cases, offensive speech silences people as well. Maybe not to the same extent, but there are certain people who are introverts or whatever, who are less likely to speak up in cases when they are, using offensive speech to other people to silence them. Right? So this is one way we can talk about. What's the other thing we can talk about?
That damages our creator and our individual.
Okay. Yeah. What are we talking about here? So what are we saying? What's the premise?
So that we need the deliberation and we need good quality deliberation to be able to fully rationalize and understand our own beliefs and to enlighten.
Okay, yes, and how do we link that back with emotion? How does offensive speech come into play?
Offensive speech damages our ability to do so because we encounter less varied opinions and we just we don't.
Okay, but that's the reason why this one's important, right? Because we silence minorities, and this for me is bad for all the reasons we talked about earlier. True. But what is a different reason why offensive speech is bad?
Maybe it would restrict their ability, someone's ability to practice liberty in the future.
Okay, practicing liberty in the future, yes. But Okay, so what's important here and what we need to be careful here is that we explicitly say that this is because offensive speech invokes an emotional argument and receives an emotional response. So that's a crucial line, right? So without that, we cannot prove this argument, right? So just be careful about that. So practice liberty limited, but we need to tie it back because emotional weight, right? So this is one argument we can make. Cool. Okay. So this is about quality deliberation. And then what Eva was talking about comes into the play, right? When you tell us how, it's important because we discussed how this is important for our self, self-development and things like that, and how this is very crucial to us as human beings and so on and so forth. So this is one argument. What's another argument? Why is another reason why we would want to recognize this guy? Okay, come on, someone.
To not that directly cause harm because male is against the harm rules.
Okay, so it cause harm. What type of harms? What are the different harms? I mean, we talked about them. So how to link them back now and make an argument that is coherent about potential harms caused by, this policy. I mean, by offensive speech, sorry. So we talked about basically two layers. One are social harms, right? When we say that things like, offensive speech and things like, stereotypes, gossip, insults, can they harm like society? Can they harm the societal discourse?
Yeah, because you don't get the full truth, you don't really get the truth.
Yeah, right? So you don't get the whole truth. Why?
Because some sides don't tell their opinion or silence.
Okay, someone's silent, yes, and someone is emotive and emotive nature, right? We talked about this earlier. Okay, anything else? So, so we need to know, so this is very abstract. How do we link it to real life? What do we say here? What can we use here? Okay, yes, but let's try to make a thought experiment, right? So, what kind of society do we get when those things happen? What is the problem with having unregulated offensive speech?
You don't get rational conversations that are based on rational opinions. Instead, you get responses that are based on emotion and your response to that was offensive in that moment.
Yeah, that's good. So what's the next thing? If we use Mill, how do we tie this back all together? What for him decreases them? Our ability to find truth, yeah. Right? So, less truth. So we live in a society that has less access to truth. Because there is, deterioration of all of the quality of deliberation, which can generally fit here, if we talk about principle in general, but it can also fit here under our harms, right? So social harm can be that we get worse discussion when everyone uses offensive language, and that we believe that that's why offensive language should be censored, at least to an extent. Right? Okay, what's the second layer? What are the more individual harms? And this we did talk about, when we started brainstorming.
You're prevented from the ability to talk about individual experiences or engage in or evaluate them because you're being offensive speech.
Okay, so can engage, but yeah, that's the point we are making a lot, right? What is different? What did we talk about here?
When your reputation is damaged, you have less opportunities because people believe lies.
Okay, so less opportunities, and what are two distinct reasons here? One is what you already mentioned, so lies. What is another reason? So slander. What is a different reason? What is another part of the definition?
Like stereotypes, expectations.
Exactly. So you must be subjected to unfair expectations. Right? So this is harmful. All of those different ways that we talked about. And how can we tie it all together? Again, it's through mirror, right? So we say, so we began this debate, or when tomorrow this debate will happen, on first speech you can say, look, there are two criteria by how we will evaluate this debate. First criteria is, we believe that offensive speech is just, inherently bad, intrinsically a bad thing. And we believe that this is why it justifies limitation. This is what we talk about here. Here then we can talk about quality of deliberation. So, offensive speech is intrinsically bad because it always increases quality of deliberation. Then there is the other thing, when we can talk about harms, we can say the second layer that we will defend our stance in this debate is by explaining to you how on balance, offensive speech produces more harms than benefits in this debate. So that utilitarian calculus is also on our side in this debate. Right? So this is how we can approach it. Okay, so we have 5 more minutes. So let's move to opposition, so to against side. What do they argue as against the motion?
Individuality
Okay?
and
In what way? Okay, so
expression is limited.
yes, so okay, I think that a very useful way to start thinking about things like that is to ask ourselves, why do we use offensive speech? And maybe this.
To silence all.
Okay? So to silence someone?
Or to critique something.
Okay. Okay, so yes, I think those are both important. So probably on the against side, we won't focus on this one that much, right? Because we try to make a better case for our side. What is about critique, right? So what can we say about here? And what is, I think there is one thing, when do we tend to be offensive? When we are? Or just angry, right? So we can ask ourselves the role of anger. So I think that on opposition, we want to think through the lenses of saying, anger and thus offensive speech is a totally natural byproduct, right, of human existence. At certain moments in life where we are, angry, when we are frustrated, we simply use offensive speech because this is the way how this is expressed, right? And this is something that we feel it's unjust to, stifle because it limits our ability to critique the world in which we live, right? So we say that, offensive speech might not be the perfect way of critiquing, but it is a way of critique, right? So it is a way in how we express our feelings and everything about the world surrounding us. Okay, so this can be our starting point. So what then, we do million critiques. Why is it not that offensive is enough? What does Mill say? If we think about it. So if we we talk mostly about harm and other stuff. But why would Mill not say that it's okay to sanction offensive speech? So it's not harm. But why is that not sufficient reason?
Because not first instance harm.
Yes? But so why is it not sufficient, right?
Because if we sanction it, it could maybe damage the utility of the.
Okay? Overall, yeah, society.
Because maybe we could look at it that this is our way of expressing our opinion, and Mill is saying that everybody should have a right to express their opinion in a debate, a reasonable debate. So sanctioning this would also prevent somebody from expressing their opinion.
Yeah, okay, let me just finish this point. I will take a minute unless anyone has to run to the bus. Okay, yes, but what is crucial here? So, if we are we all offended by the same thing? So the problem is that offensive,
General,
it's subjective, right? So, subjectivity or non-generalizability. So this is one issue, right? We cannot sanction something that's entirely subjective. This is Mill's point, right? So we can rationally see that life experiments are different and that no one overrules. But we cannot see the same, and we can see that with harm, but we cannot see the same with subjectivity. So this is the first problem. And the second, as was mentioned, is the question of utility. So now on which side do we get better consequences of the action? You argue that we get better consequences when we don't limit those things.